Well, while he gets that thing going, first of all, good morning to everybody. This presentation is a little bit similar to one I had done about a year and a half ago, but there are some differences to it, especially in light of, by the way, Anthony just did a phenomenal job. It really is, the things that he says, some of the perspectives that he mentioned in terms of how we think about it, made me want to start out a little bit differently because I wanted to explain how we got into UHPC in the first place. Now, we were a little bit less altruistic. We were not trying to solve a problem of a customer. We were trying to solve a problem of our own because our problem was we were about to lose a job. And I didn't want to lose the job. There was a slight bit of competitiveness in me at times, and I really didn't want to lose it. And so there was a job, and I apologize because I didn't put a picture in here. I didn't make my presentation self-serving, so I really didn't put pictures of our jobs in there. But there was a cornice that we were being asked to do that was about 4 foot tall and 2 foot deep. There were instances where it was even bigger. And there were about 3,000 lineal feet of it. And this exact same cornice had been done across the street on another project, and it was done in GFRC. And the GFRC that was done was produced by an APA member who did a really beautiful job and had metal framing on it, which if you were at our plant recently, you'd know we are a small format. We're 2.8 acres. We don't have the room for metal fab shops and things like that. So what happened was all of a sudden, this parking garage that we were going to do this cornice on, the people that were going after it were an uncertified plant. So now we're losing to an uncertified plant doing metal framing. And I'm like, oh, man, how do I do this? I can't lose to an uncertified plant. This is not right. It's not good for the industry. So previously, Larry Rowland, who, I don't know, Larry was at 8 jobs ago. I'm not sure how many where you were at, but he was at Lehigh White. And they had a UHPC product. And so I said, I wonder if that could be a solution. So I called up Larry and I said, hey, Larry, do you think in UHPC you could make a cornice that's 4 foot tall and 2 foot deep? And he goes, yeah, it can do that. And I called up the plant and I said, hey, listen, do you think you can make this? Oh, I don't know, we'll give it a shot, right? And talk to the installers, do you think you can install this? And, well, yeah, we think we can. And so we started going down this rabbit hole. Now this rabbit hole was a hole from hell, all right? Now, it really was because, when you're looking at some of the things like that were cast, like yesterday you were looking at casting, when you're in a flat panel, it's a relatively easy thing to do. Don't be intimidated by UHPC and flat panels. But when you go to a shape, if you're used to GFRC and you're shooting out of a gun, it sticks to the form. You don't need a back form. As soon as you go to SEC format, you start doing a cornice. If you don't have a back form, it just plops on the ground, right? So you have to have a back form to hold it. And then you get to go into the world of hydraulic pressures, right? So we have some great images. Daniel, I'm sure, has some photos on his phone if you want to see what we were having to do before we learned little tricks like turning things on its side in order to reduce point pressures and stuff like that. It was hell. But we ended up being successful at it, and here's why. And this is, you were talking about the different things. You had a couple of slides up there that were just perfect. GFRC cornice with metal framing had to be done in 2 pieces. You had a face piece, which had a metal frame, which we would weld to embeds on top of a parapet wall, and then we laid a cap on top of that. We could install 25 linear feet a day doing that. Right? We knew that because we had done it just across the street. UHPC, we were able to make these pieces, again, similar length. I think we did them 8 foot long, was our typical length. But all we had to do was Tapcon through the top into the parapet and a clip at the bottom, and we were able to install, I think it was 100 lineal feet a day. It was 8 pieces. I do 96 lineal feet. So we were doing about 100 feet a day. In fact, we could install it faster than we could produce it, which became its own other problem. Like we were delaying ourselves out there on the job site because we just didn't realize how fast it was going to go in. So you're able to install it 4 times faster, which actually allowed the UHPC, which we're going to get into in terms of the pricing here in a second, to be a more cost-effective alternative than the GFRC in that shape. but there were a lot of lessons. But that's how it started. You talked about solving problems. Sometimes it's the problem of the project, and sometimes it's your own problem. And so you're going to see as we talk about it that it really is it is another tool in the toolkit. But that was how we got into it. And then we started to look into all the other the things. Now, the one place that I will disagree with Anthony, it's kind of like green building. I don't know how many, like I said, I was a home builder, before I decided to become poor. And they always talked about, the green building, right? Well, the only green building that mattered to the customer of the home builder was money. It was the only green that mattered. And so we talk about, some of the things in terms of the problems it solves, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to what it costs. And that's the problem, right? Architectural precast, these are round numbers. It's probably up a little bit with inflation. 175, 185 a cubic yard. GFRC on the cubic yard basis runs at 2,000, and UHPC is going to run 2,350 to 2,500 a yard, right? So ultimately, are there any benefits? Where do the benefits come from that justify going to this material? And there are plenty. So I'm not trying to dissuade this thing because we are all in on the UHPC concept, right? So the first question is, why did GFRC have an impact on precast? Well, the obvious reasons are, the thin wall nature of it allows you to get rid of that mass, right? So we found that it was on about an 8-inch by 8-inch size, that once you got past that in both dimensions, you were going to save enough mass out of that piece where the GFRC became a cost-competitive alternative to precast. If we were sitting there and it was, I could have something that's 24, 36 tall, but if it was only going to be 2 or 3 thick, it didn't make any sense. We were still better off in precast than switching over to GFRC. So our rule of thumb internally in our company is about 8-inch by 8-inch. If I'm in more than that in both dimensions, then the fiber concretes begin to look like a very, very good alternative, right? So it's about that mass savings. And where it came from, and we talk about this all the time, and Jen, you're major into GFRC, I'm sure you hear this all the time as well. It's the weight. When you're coming up with something that's big in both dimensions, the amount of weight and the impact that it has on their building design for foundation. If you're going to get put into place with tower cranes, there are severe limits on the weights of tower cranes. So going into GFRC and UHPC really provides significant options for them in that situation, all right? So now the GFRC does require, now we do GFRC at our plant, we do it with ribs to the extent possible, but oftentimes the pieces are so big or they're so far off the wall, the geometry is so complex that the ribs don't work and you really have to go with metal framing. In those situations, our plant can't do it, and so that's when we begin to look at whether UHPC is an alternative, because the UHPC allows us to eliminate the metal frames. We don't have to have a metal frame when we're going into the UHPC. That was what we learned when we did that project with the cornices, right? And I apologize, I don't have the pictures in the presentation. Daniel and I both on our phones have some pictures if you want to see what we ended up doing, but a lot of you were at the plant, you saw the mock-ups of that particular piece on that wall.
Explain your 8x8 rule again.
Right, so if I have a piece, like that, it has to be more than, take a cube, right? It has to be more than 8 inches in all dimensions, right? For it to make sense for, by the way, I'm sorry, he asked the question, he was asking me to explain the 8x8. So we're competing against a cheer group back here, and we're competing against the AC. So if you hear me repeat the question, it's just making sure that the people in the back understand it. So Nick was asking about my 8x8 rule. I have to have 8 inches of minimum of at least 8 inches of depth of a piece and 8 inches of height of a piece in order for the GFRC to begin to make sense. Because the cost at $2,000 a yard versus $175 a yard, if I'm not getting rid of a significant amount of mass, then it doesn't offset that cost. Now, there might be other considerations like weight, tower crane limitations, things like that on a particular piece, but for the shapes, and this is generally referring to shapes, not panels, the shapes that we look at, like that cornice at 4 foot tall, 2 foot deep is a solid piece, would have been way too heavy for the building, way too heavy for how we had to install it, right?
When you're saying depth, you're talking about
Right,
Horizontal plane.
right, so if I'm here on the front and I'm trying, this depth, 8 inches, and then the height, vertical return of it, right? So, like I said, if you take a look at that, you remember you were at the plant, so you remember that cornice. That cornice was 4 foot tall, and it's 2 foot deep. 8 inches or exceeded in both those dimensions.
What's driving that high cost of GFRC? I had no idea it was that close, $2,500.
Well, we just did the math. We took all of our input costs, right? Because we normally price it by the square foot, right? But then we said, all right, well, what's the volume of a square foot? Let's convert that into cubic foot. We did the same thing with UHPC, and that's what it runs. It runs about $2,000 a cubic yard, and the other one runs $2,500, $2,350 to $2,500 a cubic yard, depending on your source. So, again, he was asking just where the numbers came from on the cubic yard basis.
But a cubic yard of GFRC is
A lot of material.
a lot
Mhm.
more coverage, a lot more square footage.
Correct. Which is why, and that's why I say, like I just had to come up with a rule of thumb as to where it became cost effective. And it's only 8 by 8. It's not like it's a terribly big piece that the GFRC begins to offset that precast, right? So, it's, but like I said, our plant does all the different lines. So it really affects us more on that cast stone side. So if I'm looking at some of these pieces, like all the time, architects will come in and they'll say, we want this in GFRC, and it's a 4 by 2 molding, 4 inch by 2 inch molding. Just doesn't make any sense to do that in GFRC, right? It's just too expensive per cubic yard to pour it like that. So it's just understanding when you're going to use each of these materials, right? And like I said, go ahead.
So do you mix and match? Do you do some elements of GFRC and on the same project?
Right, she's asking if we mix and match on a project, if we use both GFRC and cast stone, and the answer is yes, all the time.
And UHPC fits in there now? Can we get those match?
Yeah, UHPC is a little harder to get the exact match, but yes, we can. But if you're in small format, we usually are going to stay in the GFRC. We won't go to the UHPC. The UHPC we save for a little bit more complicated type solutions. But yes, all the time. You can make, you cannot tell the difference on a project of what's cast stone and what's GFRC. All right. The UHPC, the problem with UHPC matching is it's such a great material. The particle packing is just so good on it that it's hard to make it look as, like if you acid etch it, it just doesn't look quite exactly the same. So it's a little harder to mix and match UHPC with GFRC or precast, where GFRC and precast, they really look identical on the wall. And we'll make those decisions as to whether we're using GFRC or cast stone based on weight, right? How easy is it? Like if I got guys working on a swing stage, right? Because our plant, we're turnkey, we have to do everything. We have to install what we produce. So if we're going up a swing stage, we're probably going to try to change something off the GFRC because it's lighter. I can get a little bit bigger piece inside the swing stage to get it installed, right? But yes, we will mix and match those quite often. So why UHPC? Now GFRC, the typical wall thickness, at least in our experience, is about 3/4. UHPC is 5/8. So basically the same thing. Both those are giving you the same advantage of lighter weight, right? So yes, technically UHPC is a little bit heavier, but it's not a material factor in what we're doing. The big difference for us is that while we still will need to put ribs in, which we're doing with the GFRC anyway, we avoid having to use the metal frames. That's where we were able to get that job in South Florida on that garage doing these cornices, because I could eliminate that metal frame. And so now the UHPC allowed me to do very long pieces. Again, GFRC, I had to make it in 2 pieces. UHPC, I could do it in 1. That cap was integral with the actual face of the cornice. I did not have to do that in 2 pieces. That allowed me to be able to do more installation in the day, right? Because I'm installing 8 pieces of UHPC, I was still installing 6 pieces of GFRC, but those 6 pieces only represented 3 sections instead of 8, right? So it was a big difference for us, all right? So one of the other things too, when we're talking about the UHPC panels, is that and this is actually a ceiling section that was done in a hotel. We price per panel, right? And that's what I was trying to explain. So anybody who comes out of the precast world, when you're talking to a certified installer, these certified installers are giving you a per pick price. They don't really care what size it is. For them, it's all the same. So how can I reduce panel count? The panel count's going to save me. UHPC will allow you to reduce panel count, whether that's because of its characteristics, its strength profile, strength characteristics, I maybe can get a bigger piece. But also, like I said, the fact that if I have set things that need to be in multiple pieces in order to put them together, I can now do it in a single piece just because of the strength profile of the UHPC. Right? Does that make sense? Everybody understand that? But the other thing, and I wanted to get to, it's going to come down. Let me just screw it. Yeah. Okay. So this is where we're talking now. The other part of that, we see a lot of times now where people are asking us to look at balcony railing systems. And the balcony railing system, they're coming at it with a GFRC design. Okay, here's another situation in which UHPC actually can solve a problem, because in the GFRC design, the GFRC itself is not a structural element. So when let's say they attach that to the building and they want to put a railing system on there, a glass rail, they have to go through the GFRC and attach the glass rail back to the slab, to the structural slab. The slab has to support the rail because the GFRC cannot. You said that you don't have a lot of experience in architectural, and the reason is, and you'll have a slide that says it later on, 90% of the use of GFRC in Europe is architectural, 10% structural. In the United States, it's the exact opposite. 90% of the use of UHPC in the United States is structural, only 10% architectural. But it is a structural concrete at the end of the day. So if you're doing a railing, if you're doing a slab edge, that slab edge can take the railing. It can hold it. It can support it, right? Because it's structural. You don't now need to go back to the slab. Because what happens is on these railing systems, when you go back to the slab, you have to put a break in on GFRC, you're creating a leak point, right? Sooner or later, it's going to leak. And in Florida, we have these things called Section 528 claims. There's not a condo that's built in the state of Florida that does not come with 2 lawsuits, right? They budgeted in, right? I came from the developer side. They budgeted in. They know they're getting these lawsuits. It's how the COAs and the HOAs get funded. They fund through these lawsuits. The number one point of contention.
Then, I'm going to throw up a mix in the lab and try an SCC.
Well, that's,
Anthony's right on that. The annual expense in developing is very high, north of 100, 200,000 a year that you're investing into time, money, testing, and you're not even getting this complete. We still look at projects and we look at the liability. And if the liability is high, then the assumption is we're going to a pre-manufactured product that we can stand behind. And so it's really gauged from our standpoint as to when we can introduce our mix design and the liability is low, and we're confident in the results that we've developed over the last year and a half, or we are pricing the project just based on the fact that that cost is not going to drive the price. And when you're looking at the coverage that you're getting on an 1.5-inch panel, it certainly offsets a big part of that cost regard.
it's also sometimes you have to think about it in terms of margin opportunity. So if you develop a mix that's sub 1,000 and you know that GFRC is at 2,000 and UHPC is at 2,350 to 2,500, you don't have to price it like your cost is at 800 either. So there's sometimes some margin opportunity in there just to play the arbitrage but again, it's strength profile. But it becomes a cat chasing its tail too. So we're looking at, like I said, this one project right now, and we're wondering, okay, well, hey, which mix do we use, similar type of thing, you know, what's the risk profile, et cetera. But it's also the question of, you know, which comes first, the design criteria of the job or what your mix is capable of doing, right? So you have to almost, if you want to know what your mix is capable of doing, you've got to finish your R&D process and get it tested so that you understand what that product can actually do. And otherwise, you are taking a little bit of a risk in saying, well, I think it can do this. Go ahead and bid the job at that price so that you're more competitive, and then you find out that it doesn't work and you're going to end up buying, you know, a true UHPC blend. So there is a little bit of a, you know, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Are you going to, you know, you have to know what your mix is really capable of doing before you can necessarily use that mix in a true bidding situation. So I'm just looking ahead at my slides. I know I've jumped ahead and done all my slides that are beyond me, but Daniel, are there anything that I'm missing in here that you want to add? You know, for those like you, Craig, anybody else that's using UHPC, please disagree with me. You know, give some different perspectives to what's going on here. Again, what I'm trying to do, and the reason I loved Anthony's conversation is Anthony's conversation was from the standpoint of the vendor, the manufacturer of the cement. What I'm doing is I'm trying to give you the perspective of a plant. This is how we got into it. This is what we're looking at. For us, you know, he's going to sell value because he has to. A lot of times I don't know that my customer appreciates value. Now, I did agree with the one point that he said, if I can do something at the same price and it's better, that's a lock, right? But we have had to go in on this and actually tell people, hey, this is a better project for UHPC. And they will listen, but they will stop listening a lot of times if the price gets out of hand, because at least in our market in South Florida, it comes down to price. You know, it's like, that's why we lose jobs to uncertified plants, because, I mean, that should never happen, but they will, because they're going to take a price over anything else. So as much as we want to say it doesn't matter, I would imagine it's probably the same in any market. You know, if you got a job, you were probably competitive. You know, so if your price is not, it's not going to work. So if any of the other producers have any input on that, or if people who aren't doing it yet, if you have any other questions, by all means, go in, because like I said, I've been through, you know, there's other things. Like, so this is one of the reasons, when you went to our plant, we talked about the fact that we've diversified. We do all the product lines, and that's because we wanted to be able to provide that solution no matter what. So we will do the cast stone, the GFRC, the precast, and now the UHPC. And we do look for those opportunities, and they come to us quite frequently. There are times the architects are getting more and more interested in this. They're going to these different seminars. I think you guys were talking about, you were at the one in Delaware, and I think it's going to be in Europe. I mean, people are traveling to these things. People are very, very interested, especially on the design side. It's starting to get that architectural interest, right? If it wasn't, you wouldn't have 88 people here. And that's the bottom line, right? And Tim didn't strong arm that many people, right?
Yeah,
So,
I did.
you know, so, but that's it. Like, you know, I said 90% of the use is structural. There it is. I mean, there's some really cool videos online about, you know, some of the beams that have been done in Asia, just how long some of the beams, and they're able to make the webs thinner and thinner. They can use less material. And that's really the part that has to stick in your mind, is how do I use less material? You know, if I have an opportunity that using less material can bring an advantage, that's where UHPC is going to end up coming in, right? So, and that's where, you know, if you're in this room, you have that opportunity to be a leader in the space. And when you have somebody like Cientech and you have somebody like Larry, you know, that are just both really great UHPC knowledge bases, and Vic, you know, don't mean to leave you out, Vic, but I'm just saying Cientech and what Heidelberg does. You know, these are incredible resources that sit in the industry that are ready to support you. And if you're being in this room, then you have an interest in it and you can be a leader, because there aren't many people that are doing it. We get weird calls from strange places because seriously, because people aren't doing it, right? So, you know, they know that, you know, they do a Google search and they find out that you're doing UHPC, and all of a sudden you're getting phone calls because, you know, like there was one that somebody crapped out. You know, there was a company in Canada, they thought they could do it. They ended up not being able to do it. They just abandoned the job, you know? So there are not many people in the market that are doing it. So there is an opportunity if you're willing to go through, you know, the little bit of the curve. start flat. Flat panels, you know, you're used to doing flat panels and you're used to making the molds and the form liners and the blockouts and things like that. That's the easy place to start. And yes, you can make it a little bit more complicated with, you know, returns and things like that. Shapes become really difficult because shapes you have to have the back form, and with the back form you have to worry about hydraulic pressures in ways that you've not experienced before. Take a look at Daniel's photos. And when they blow out, that's an expensive problem at 1350, you know, it's, sorry, 2350 a yard.